Guys, my name is Dylan, and today we are going to be talking about integration versus segregation in schools. This week, we were given the opportunity to listen to two podcasts. The first was about accidental integration, while the second was about a city actively coming together to integrate their schools. In the first podcast, we look at the Normandy School District, one of the worst school districts. I believe they were unaccredited for over 15 years, which is unheard of. So these students were able to enact the transfer law and transfer to an accredited school district, the Francis Howell School District. But the parents of the Francis Howell School District, a primarily white school, were in an outrage about these new students coming in. They held a town hall meeting and basically talked about how these kids were going to bring violence into their school. They were going to bring drugs. They were going to lower their test scores. They were going to need metal detectors, and kind of made it a very toxic situation for these Normandy children who were just trying to transfer to get an appropriate education that they deserve. So after a year of these 1,000 kids that transferred over to Francis Howell, the state stepped in and kind of rebranded the Normandy School District as the Normandy School Collaboration. And since they did that, it was now a non-accredited school, so all of these children who had transferred no longer are protected by the transfer law and are now sent back to the Normandy School District and situation and environment that they were trying to escape. Now, the second podcast we listened to was about the Hartford, Connecticut schools. Basically, what happened there was the schools in Hartford were just in terrible shape. So much so that a man named John Britton stepped in and sued the state for the school, and everyone backed him up. I mean, the Board of Education backed him up, educators, parents, like anyone who was involved in the Hartford school districts wanted to be involved in this case and be an advocate for it. So he ends up winning this lawsuit, and all of this money is funded into these schools. And they called them magnet schools. And basically what they did is they kind of rebuilt these lower income, impoverished schools, and they made it seem more like a choice. They stepped in with commercials that were targeted at primarily white students. I believe they called them reduced isolation students. And basically made it a choice for these kids to go into these schools. And these schools, they had insect houses and planetariums and aquatic labs, and they were more specialized schools that, students could really feel like they were getting the best education at. And a lot of these students went to these schools, and parents were talking about these schools, and everyone was talking about these specialized magnet schools and wanting to be involved in it and part of it, which is great. They integrated these quote unquote, bad schools in these bad neighborhoods. And they, kids would go into the city with their parents to school, and they made integration a choice. And I love that. So basically what we're here for is we're going to be discussing the two podcasts, and what our thoughts on this podcast were. My first reaction was that this was really awful, like that it wasn't even that long ago. Like I felt like I could have been listening to a story of 1950 or the early 1900s, where segregation was really a big thing. I didn't realize that it still existed today. I guess I kind of just lived in this blissful bubble. I grew up in a very loving environment where we were celebrated for our differences. I went to elementary school at a primarily Latino school. I learned English as a second language. I've always kind of been lucky enough not to see that side of the world. So I really didn't realize that it still existed today. Um, I was already immersed in those situations, and I still am. I live in Palm Springs, California, which is a very diverse, community. And just hearing these podcasts, I loved the idea of what they did for the students, primarily in the second podcast, where the whole city came together to work for them, for these students to integrate these schools. Until towards the end of the second podcast, they started talking about like these public school families that couldn't get into these, magnet schools. They felt stuck. They felt like they weren't able to get this great education. This school down the road had an aquatic center and, an insect lab, and they couldn't be a part of it. So I think that really does take its toll on children. I felt like in the first podcast, like those Normandy kids felt helpless. They really did. And I imagine that the kids from the second podcast, in the public schools that couldn't make it into these magnet schools because they were so sought after that there was a waiting list, that they probably felt hopeless too, that they weren't able, or that they weren't good enough, that they weren't able to be part of this enriched environment. As for like the Francis Howell children, unfortunately, I don't believe that they were, they're very unaffected. It probably didn't matter much to them, like when the kids came in versus when they left. Didn't make a difference. As for the magnet kids, same thing. They're just lucky to be in that environment, and I feel like they're kind of unaffected by it, which is sad to say. Now, when I become an educator, this is something I'm going to really advocate for is, this overall acceptance and love of everyone. And how do you handle, bringing that into somebody else's world that isn't ready for that? Once I start working as an educator, I'm gonna be like Eden from the second one. When I hear that little hesitation of, are they interested? Do they want to fight for this? I'm going to be like, I have 2 podcasts for you to really listen to. I would love for you to hear these and, share your thoughts with me. Like she did, she just kind of implanted it right where like there was a spot. She saw it, she took it. Like I'm going to do the exact same thing when I work as an educator. This is definitely a concern beyond schools. It's a city and state level. It's a national level, concern. We got to be more like John Britton and fight for these kids. If we're not going to fight for them, who's going to fight for them? We got to go out and make a difference. And like I said, luckily I live in a very diverse, city. I live in Palm Springs. There's always something going on for every culture to celebrate everyone. And so I really don't feel like there's that big of a segregation problem here. It's very integrated. But if there were, I know that our city would be down to hear any input from anyone involving what we could do to kind of better their situations. And I'm going to end with a quote that I absolutely loved from the podcast. I think that children can overcome the stigma of poverty. I think that children can overcome the stigma of their ethnicity. What they cannot overcome is the stigma of separation. That is like a damned spot in their being. and their self-image. That's what segregation does to children. They see themselves as apart or separate because of the way they speak, because of the color of the skin, or the origin of their parents.